Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. Unfortunately, I'm on my own, even though it was advertised that the amazing Michelle Redfern was coming on to chat to me about all things gender equity. Unfortunately, for personal reasons, Michelle's been unable to attend at the last minute. So I promise those of you who are tuning in that specifically to hear the amazing things that Michelle would have to say, that we will reschedule that, and I will advertise that across all the platforms so that you can be aware of when that's coming up and still manage to join in on that conversation. But it has been such a long time since I had a LinkedIn Live that I figured I would still go live anyway. And talk about gender equity, because that was the topic of today's conversation. So before I jump on to any of that, I do want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live, work and play, which is the Wadawurrung people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and a big call out to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are watching this show today, either live or on the replay. Just recently, during NAIDOC week, down here in Geelong, the local newspaper, which is called the Geelong Advertiser, renamed itself the Geelong Advertiser, which was the traditional name of the area. And we saw that the committee, I believe it was the Committee for Geelong or the Chamber of Commerce, one of those also changed their name as well. I think it was the committee. And so I think that's some nice progress moving forward. But I certainly love to see that in Victoria, the Aboriginal flag is now flying permanently on the Westgate Bridge. I know many of you and I have questioned that over many years as to why it only went up during NAIDOC week and then came down again. But yeah, great to see that is going to continue to fly up there where it should be. Gender equity, right? I've got some topics down here that I would like to talk to you all about, but I would prefer to talk about things that you would like to talk about. So if there are particular topics around gender equity, specifically in the workplace, but also doesn't have to be, that you are pondering at the moment, or that you're being challenged by, or that you just want to get my ideas or thoughts on, please feel free to place that in the chat, either whichever platform that you're watching from. Even if you're watching this on the replay, stick your questions in there and I can come back around to it in other ways through other posts, or maybe come on and have another live. Or they might be topics that Michelle and I can talk about when Michelle does come on live with me. So while you're thinking about that and sending some comments or suggestions through, I wanted to first start off by talking about the gender kind of age penalty. It's really topical at the moment, right? The ageism and age as an element, as a focus point for diversity and inclusion work. It hasn't always been. And certainly whenever I'm analysing data around diversity and inclusion in any form, I'm always looking at age and looking at the intersection of age with gender, with cultural or ethnic background, with sexuality, and seeing how that plays out differently. Just recently, I was running some focus groups for a university, and it was really interesting that, you know, it's a progressive university doing some amazing stuff in the LGBTIQA+ space. But it was interesting to hear from senior queer people and senior lesbians, and how at times they felt left out by the initiatives that were being run for LGBTIQA+ people, that they felt it was quite often aimed at a younger demographic, and they didn't feel that it fitted right for them. And it's a really good reminder for us that particularly LGBTIQA+ people are from all ages, and we need to make sure that any inclusion initiatives that we do really do consider age as an element as well. The other thing that really brought age to my mind recently was some data that I was looking through that demonstrated that there was definitely a penalty in terms of time it took, or age bracket, that women were reaching leadership roles in comparison to men. And so I would really strongly encourage you to look within your organisations and look at the ages of the leaders, and if there is a gender difference. Now, I've done this with organisations where we've seen no penalty for women. So if men are most likely to be leaders in the 40 to 49-year-old age bracket, we see a similar thing for women. Of course, always calling out that often data isn't collected around non-binary and gender diverse people, so we don't always have that statistic to compare as well. But in some organisations, like one I was looking at recently, it was if you were a man between the ages of 30 and 39, you had a much greater chance than women in that organisation in that same age bracket of being in a senior leadership role. Now, what does that mean? People say, well, childbearing age, so it will take time. Women will be out of the workplace for a period of time. They might not be. They might be still there. They might be working part-time. They might have only had a year off. Equity means actually making sure that those parenting responsibilities don't actually draw out their career progression. They don't impact their career progression. Because if we truly want diverse leadership, we can't allow that to happen. So a lot of our gender equity initiatives are focused on reducing the impact of parental leave, right? Recognising that sometimes there's way too much focus on parents when it comes to gender equity, and that there are also women who aren't parents who do experience, and gender diverse people who do experience career barriers, and we need to centre that as well. But a lot of the gender equity work we do is focused on mitigating the impact of those career breaks. Well, is that actually having an impact? Or are we seeing, when we look at that age data, that in fact, it is taking 10, maybe 15 years longer for a woman to reach a leadership role, a senior leadership role, than it is for a man. I remember a very long time ago, the former Vice Chancellor of Deakin said to me that she had looked at that data in terms of the people who were holding Vice Chancellor positions across Australia. And she estimated that there was a 10 to 15 year age penalty, which meant that when women were actually securing those Vice Chancellor roles, they were well into sometimes their 60s, which limited the amount of time that they could contribute as a Vice Chancellor. This is at the end of their career and not necessarily in an earlier time bracket where they could be a Vice Chancellor for longer and use that knowledge to build and improve an organisation. So I think this is really important that we do raise the importance of age when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and not just looking at gender, also looking at cultural background, sexuality, and how our inclusion initiatives need to shift, need to change, need to be responsive to the different challenges and barriers that people in different age brackets will face. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on that. And I'd love to hear anybody who is doing or has seen some really good practice in this space, particularly around the intersections of age and other demographics. So if you could comment in the chat or send me a message, I'd be really keen to hear the type of work that's going on. And if there's somebody who'd like to come on this show in the future and talk about these issues, that would also be very welcome. So the next topic I had here, and I see nobody sent me through any other topics yet, so I'll keep an eye out for that. But the next topic I wrote down was promotions and policies around promotions. And this is one of my kind of favourite and least favourite topics because you see so much focus on when we're creating promotion policies or reviewing promotion policies, regardless of what industry we're in. It's all about trying to make fair and equitable promotion processes. Unfortunately, though, sometimes those policies, and probably more often than not, they rely upon things that aren't focused on inclusion. So they might rely upon time at task or years of experience. Essentially to be able to meet the minimum requirements to be promoted from this level to the next, you have to have spent a significant period of time in that role. And the more time you've spent perhaps in that role, then the more likely you are to get that promotion, regardless of whether you deserve the promotion or already operating at that high level anyway in your role. You have to meet, in the academic world, it's called the minimum requirements, right? The minimum standards. And those minimum standards are quite often not based on equity at all. They're based on time at task. So what do I mean by that? Say we develop a promotions policy and we say, you know, anybody who is achieving X, Y, Z can apply to be promoted. Well, we need to look at what X, Y, Z is. And we need to fully understand what the barriers might be to achieving X, Y, Z. And if one of the barriers is that really those who have achieved X, Y, Z in the past are all working 50, 60 hours a week, then that's a barrier, right? And that's an inequitable barrier because we know that not all people have the access or opportunity to work at that level or want to. And we want to get diversity in leadership and through our promotions policies. So we need to change those policies. So thinking about what barriers exist to achieving the things that we're asking people to achieve to be eligible for promotion? And are we applying equity there? Sounds a little bit, it's hard to explain without specific examples. And I don't want to go too much into the academic world and the examples around academic promotions, because I think there's such an opportunity here for industries outside of higher education who maybe don't have that really structured promotion process to review how people do get promotions. Is it tap on the shoulders? Are they direct appointments? Are we measuring our direct appointments in the organisation by gender, by race, by disability, by sexuality? Direct appointments are one of the one of the areas or processes that are most impacted by bias, privilege, influence, networking. Right? And we know so many organizations still have internal direct appointment processes. And sure, usually there's a policy in place that says, well, if we do direct appointments, we must have a letter that is signed by the head of HR to say that this is appropriate and that all these things must accompany it to make sure that it's okay. But are we actually tracking the data on who is getting access to those direct appointments? Who are the managers asking to appoint directly? We've seen some organisations do this and the data's been really revealing and not okay in any way. And those organisations have shifted their practices and made it so that there are open, fair recruitment practices for all positions, not just most positions. So thinking about direct appointments, that's another one where we really see bias weave its way in and privilege get perpetuated. How are people in your organisation actually getting promoted and moving up the internal career ladder? We need to, really thoughtfully reflect on that and review that. And then so that we can put things in place that make sure that there are actual equal opportunities and that we're providing equity where it's needed. If there is equity that is needed for somebody to be able to make their way through a promotion process whilst also having spent time out of work, caring children, elderly, parents, whoever it may be, then we need to put those things in place and we need to be intentional about it. So I'm probably rabbiting on a little bit about that topic, but I find that it is so important that we get that right. And it's quite often not seen as one of the key diversity and inclusion focus areas. Usually we're focused on recruitment and we're focused on training and education. And sometimes we miss that promotion process policy. And also sometimes we miss performance reviews. How are performance reviews being undertaken? What's the accountability on leaders in terms of what kind of ratings they provide? Because they impact the promotion process, right? How is bias weaving its way into those performance reviews, and how do we actively mitigate against it? Now, those types of things I talk very specifically about in the Inclusive Leadership Workshop that I run, because it's really important that we spend the time to think about that in our context, in our organisational context, because the answers are different for every business, depending on the industry, the processes, the culture, etc. So it's important that we reflect on that individually in the organisations. Anyway, the last topic that I had here to talk about was, we saw a lot of stuff recently around the gender pay gap. And we certainly saw some data come out from WGEA about the generational pay gap or the age pay gap as well. So it's important to get your head across that and look at that. I saw a really great post from Kate Fenwick. If you're not following Kate on LinkedIn, please do. They're a great LGBTIQA+ advocate, and particularly around trans and gender diverse people, and also happen to be an excellent diversity and inclusion professional. So somebody to be watching and following. And they wrote a very relevant post around the lack of commentary on trans and gender diverse pay gaps. We talk, unfortunately, WGEA has been very binary in its approach to pay gaps. And I understand why, having been somebody who works constantly with data. I certainly understand the difficulty in creating pay gaps that go beyond gender, man versus women. Most of that's around sample size, around the comfort levels of our employees to share their gender identity with us, but also around minimum sample sizes in terms of how we need to quote the gender pay gap. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be still focusing there and looking at that specifically. And it might be that we're doing that on a proactive basis. So rather than seeing actual data that's there, we might be proactively thinking about how our remuneration policies are applied, what's written into them in terms of how we create equity, which is something we need to do anyway for the binary gender pay gap, right? But I think there's also some specific things that we can do with data when we have it, particularly for larger organisations. And I have seen some interesting stuff done in that space. I think the important message from Kate's post around trans and gender diverse people is that certainly they put some statistics in there about the unemployment level of trans and gender diverse people. And I think there might have been something also around average pay that people may expect as a trans and gender diverse person. Why? Because of discrimination, because of harassment, because of lived experience of exclusion and excommunication potentially from family members, etc., etc. Comes down to a lack of privilege in a society that really still is creating a challenging environment for people who are trans and gender diverse. So work on your policies around LGBTIQA+ inclusion, and particularly trans and gender diverse inclusion. And then you are absolutely working on your pay gap as well. But also consider how you might think about your pay gap beyond binary gender. And that includes race, and we're seeing some really interesting things in that space around ethnicity and pay gaps. You can measure who's in your leadership roles and what the diversity is of the people who are in your leadership roles, who's missing, who's not there. And, you know, on this program before, I've spoken with Christina Ryan about the real lack of leaders with disability in Australian workplaces. All of those things impact the pay gap, right? We just need to be intentional about it and recognise that people are intersectional, that there are various elements of our identities that impact the way we exist in the workplace. And we can't just be thinking about gender in isolation. We need to think about all of the other identity attributes that influence our experience and influence our pay, right, and our remuneration and the equity of that. Now, I've rabbited on a bit. It's been a while since I've jumped on live and done one of these by myself. As I said, really disappointed that Michelle couldn't make it today, but I totally understand. My thoughts are with her. And if I will definitely reschedule that and we'll get that conversation happening. As I said, put any comments, thoughts, questions in the chat when you're watching this, and I'll attempt to get back to you in the chat field or maybe on another one of these live shows. If you are interested in talking to us about the Inclusive Leadership Workshop that we run, it is by far my favourite thing to do, mainly because I feel that it is the most impactful, which is really odd considering I remember being so anti-training when it comes to diversity and inclusion work. And I still have a lot of that sentiment. that there's too many organizations who are relying on training to change their culture. And we know when it comes to diversity and inclusion that it doesn't work. But good training combined with a strong diversity and inclusion action plan, and where we're using the training to inform, in the inclusive leadership workshop, we're using the training to inform our leaders and our people managers how to be inclusive, but also how to recognize the barriers that do exist within our workplaces and the type of systemic changes we can make to create more inclusion, to increase the diversity of our workforces, and not just rely on people being good or being well-intentioned, to actually shift that dial by intentionally creating inclusive spaces and workplaces. So I am very passionate about that workshop, and if you would like to chat more with me about how that runs, how it operates, and what kind of outcomes we get with people that we work with in that way, I'm really happy to do that. So you can jump onto my website, breegorman.com.au, and you can head to the training page, which has the inclusive leadership workshops, and get a bit more information there. And you can also book a meeting with me straight from that website to chat about your options. Having said that, my calendar is nearly full for this year. So if you do want to get in, please do that quickly. Otherwise, we're starting to book into next year as well. So it might be that makes sense for you. Have a really good week. I'm plugging through more data so that I can share more findings with people. I'm also I've taken on a role with the Australian Antarctic Division as a diversity and inclusion subject matter expert, for whatever that means. I'm really looking forward to working with that division to create more inclusion and a more diversity within their workforce. And so that's a really exciting project for me that I'm going to be focused on this week. I'm also analysing some survey data from another organisation that I've been working with for a while now, and looking at how their employees are responding to some of the diversity and inclusion programs and initiatives that we've been running. So that's always exciting for me to see. Fingers crossed that we are having an impact with the work that we're doing. Anyway, reach out if you want to chat. Otherwise, enjoy your day, and any questions, shove there in the comment space. And I'll see you next time.